Hi, and welcome to Ward 13. Our guest today via telephone is Dan Koppel, who, with Robert Meyer, MD, wrote the book Every Minute is a Day, a doctor, an emergency room, and a city under siege. And as you can see by my sticky notes, I I was really impressed by this book. But Dan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, hi. Yeah, my name is Dan Koppel, and I'm a writer. I live in Portland, Maine, I've been a journalist for about 30 years. This book is an interesting book. It's about the first few days or months of COVID-19 in New York, and my co-author Rob Meyer is not just an emergency room doctor in New York. He's also my cousin, and he was trained and mentored by my own father, the late Richard Koppel, who also was an emergency room doctor. So it was really an unusual and very close collaboration between us that came out of our lifelong relationship.
It's interesting because, as you said, he's your first cousin, and your father, who was an ER doctor himself, gave Rob his first job. Dan, can you tell us what the difference? What is an ER doctor? An emergency room
Well,
doctor?
an ER doctor is an emergency room doctor, and that is these days that is an official accredited specialty. So it's something you train for. You do a residency, and you undergo testing to become an emergency room or an emergency department physician. Now, in my dad's day, that wasn't the case. The emergency room was sort of a place where surgeons or other kinds of doctors moonlighted. We've seen a lot of changes. My dad was one of the earlier ones to specialize in emergency medicine as a profession even before it was recognized as a specialty. And these days, it is absolutely a specialty. You won't find non-accredited emergency room doctors in many emergency rooms in the United States these days.
Yeah, I found the book fascinating for many reasons, but the one about the history of emergency room doctors. I have my friend Gonzo here, an artist.
How you doing? It was a
Hi
pleasure
there.
meeting. I listened to some of your book, and yeah, it's intense.
Oh yeah,
Very real, I would
it's
say.
amazing book. You know, Dan. Well, we could talk about that. We only have him for a half hour because
Okay,
the book was published yesterday. It's getting great reviews, and
awesome.
I want to get him back and get him a Matt show, but we might never see him again. Just kidding. But back in the days when, like, I guess when we were kids, it was called ambulatory care, the emergency room, and doctors didn't have to even be certified. Now, your cousin Rob, 25 years as an ER doctor, which I guess in the old days that would be been unusual. You know, you might have done ER stint because your mentor requested to come, get the experience, whatever, and then you'd move on to something more remunerative. But his mentor, Rob, was a man named John Gallagher. And can you tell us something about John Gallagher, about who he was and where he created the practice that Rob still works at for after 25 years?
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Gallagher is still around. He's very recently retired, and he was Rob's true mentor after my dad. And Dr. Gallagher is one of the people who was absolutely instrumental, not just in ensuring that emergency medicine was a specialty that doctors had to train for and be certified in, but also in creating a culture of the modern emergency room. You know, it used to be that many doctors felt contempt for people coming into their emergency rooms with things that seemed less than emergencies. There was a phrase called Gomer, and these patients were referred to as Gomers, which stood for get out of my emergency room. And Dr. Gallagher was one of the first to say, you know what, our job is to serve the community. And when people come in here for a reason, that's because they can't get care anywhere else. And he expanded the idea of what an emergency room was for. He made it a place where nobody could get turned away. And that's especially important in a place like the Bronx at Montefiore Hospital, which is where the book takes place, because the Bronx is the sickest county in the urban county in the United States. People don't have primary care physicians. And so the idea of what is a medical emergency is not just the heart attacks and the COVID-19 and the car accidents and the gunshots and stabbings and all that stuff. It's everything that anybody needs to come in there for. And Dr. Gallagher was really instrumental in helping these young doctors understand that they were privileged to provide service to their community, and that they not only had no rights to treat these people coming in with contempt, but that this was an absolutely wrong-headed way to practice medicine. And Dr. Gallagher deserves a ton of credit for shifting that pervasive attitude that dominated emergency medicine in up until the 80s or even 90s.
Yeah, what's amazing reading the book is at first, I must compliment you. First, the book has no fat in it at all. It's just a compulsive read, and it's focused. And at first you're thinking, by God, as it starts developing COVID, and they don't understand it. Or like with incubation versus proning, something as simple as proning, putting somebody on their side, and which is much more effective, how they're learning this stuff. What started striking me is here you are in which I'm going to use the word infamous, which I shouldn't, but the culture that I grew up in, I was born in 1959, the South Bronx became infamous about like the failure of urban cities. I lived in New York in the early 80s, and Paul Newman made a horrible movie about the South Bronx. We won't get into that, but is the community, the dedication of the community that Dr. Gallagher tells his people, he's training, because he's training doctors just like Rob does, and he's telling them, you treat these people like they were like a relative of yours, rather, and to listen to them. And listening to them, they'll tell you, and I think your father, who trained Rob too, was a person that great empathy, a great listener, and you can read people because they're not going to, you listen, and you can read them from their reactions. So what happens when suddenly people have to put on PPE to that paradigm?
Yeah, and this was a real source of frustration for doctors. The inability to communicate with patients because they couldn't look at them, they couldn't touch them, they couldn't approach them. This was intensely frustrating. It was. Obviously with COVID, it was not necessarily a challenge diagnostically, because it was known what the patients had, but in terms of how to treat patients, how to communicate, how to make them feel cared for, which is just as important as actually providing medicine, x-rays, scans, all that stuff, how to make them feel cared for. So difficult when everybody is wrapped in aluminum foil. And when I was down there at the hospital, in those early days before PPE was sort of standardized, you had doctors walking around in what looked like beekeeper suits. It was crazy, and the wards were crowded, people shoulder to shoulder, and you couldn't see a face among them because everybody was covered, and it was so difficult, and especially for these particular doctors who have been steeped in this more personal, verbal, connected approach. It was very frustrating. Very difficult, very emotionally traumatizing even.
Yeah, because by Dr. Gallagher and then Deb White, who was the head of Rob's, what would you call it, a hospital, or it's the medical center?
Yeah, Rob's hospital. She was Rob's boss, director of the emergency room at Rob's particular branch of Montefiore. There were 3 or 4 major Montefiore medical centers
serving the Bronx, and the dedication they have to the community. I mean, like Rob, when you're writing Rob's story, which is an interesting thing too, when you email him, and then he's, let me write that, you ask him about the first email he sends to him when I get through this, but that they're so they actually have seen, because poor people in the Bronx don't have primary care physicians, they've seen a lot of these patients before, and they bonded with them, and they bonded with the community, and suddenly a pandemic the like that hasn't been seen probably since 1918-19 in the original flu epidemic. It really created a great deal of stress on everybody. So,
Well, my takeaway from listening, I didn't read it. I listened to some of the book, and on Gallagher, I like how he just didn't let any of the doctors act better than the patients,
Yeah.
and I think that translated into success. And you mentioned the leaning sideways thing, John.
oh yeah, proning.
The revolutionary technology that came from that learning is used today, where they put these people on their stomachs, and it's saving lives. And unfortunately, a few had to, to go. But from that knowledge, people are,
Yeah, when you read the book, Dad.
and not even COVID, it's just
Right.
ventilator now.
When you read the book, one of the things is all of a sudden these doctors that have been trained for all these situations, like an ER, everything that you see, and all of a sudden it's chaos, wasn't it, down there?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because we have algorithm-based medicine now, and I think that's generally been a benefit. It's good fundamentally that you go into any ER in the country and your symptoms line up, and the best practices are usually performed on you. It's not like it was 30 years ago where, maybe you had a heart attack, maybe you got a stent, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Pretty much it's known what to do in most cases, and usually what's done is the thing that's been statistically proven to have the best results. But with COVID, there was no template. There were
Right.
no algorithms. And so it was old-fashioned medicine in a way, learning by doing. And the quicker they learned, the better it was for the patients. And they learned quickly. And I would argue that, as much grief as sort of urban hospitals sometimes get for their busyness, the chaos, the variety of patients, compared to the major suburban, wealthier medical centers, a place like Montefiore was so perfectly equipped to learn quickly, because
Right.
these guys are always thinking on their feet. They see everything. They're drilling for everything. They're doing terrorism drills. They're doing chemical attack drills. They're doing just natural disaster drills, things that the suburban hospitals, the wealthier hospitals, just aren't doing. And so at Montefiore, there was this culture of being ready for anything. And yeah, did it take a few weeks or a few months to figure it all out? Of course it did. But I think they could not have done it any quicker, and no hospital did it
Right.
quicker. And there were other hospitals in New York. You got to say, similar hospitals in Queens, in Brooklyn, that were all coming up with these same conclusions at the same time, because the doctors were working so hard, comparing notes and figuring it out as they went along, and they all came up with the answers around the same time.
Yeah, one thing reading your book is that an emergency room doctor of the new generation that Rob probably was the first generation of, because you could be an ER doctor in the 70s and not even be board certified, which is, strange to think, but I just recently watched Paddy Chayefsky's The Hospital, which is from 1971, and with a great performance by George C. Scott, by the way. And thank God we live in different times. But as much as these people, like Rob, when you're writing about Rob, is that he likes the variety, he likes being in there and being so intimately involved with the people, but suddenly they're overwhelmed with the chaos. And I want to get to, after I finish this, the idea of fear. But in the book, there was the creation of order from chaos. They managed this overwhelming workload, but while they had to cope with death, hopelessness, and survivor's guilt. Survivor's guilt is, yeah. But what about fear? Like, here's Rob, who is a fascinating person and who seems to be brave in any traditional sense of the word, and a person of honor. And suddenly he has to cope with fear, like he's a soldier on a battlefield.
And I think a lot of these guys say they weren't brave, and
Right.
because they were afraid. But to me, bravery is actually when you go forward, when you are afraid.
Yes.
And they were all afraid, and everyone handled it differently. And there were doctors, we heard of who retired, and there were doctors who used their vacation days. But most of them, whether it was Sean the orderly who went from sweeping up to carrying bodies, to the nurse practitioners, to everybody, they showed up, and some of them got sick, and they all, Rob told me, I said, how did you react when colleague A got sick and you knew you had been working next to him for a week,
right?
And he said, well, we rationalized it. I think, well, that guy, he was 2 pounds overweight, so he had a risk factor, and I'm not. So they would come up with these absurd sort of mental gymnastics to find ways to say it's not going to happen to me. They had to do that. I don't think any of them were sort of like cowering and then getting to the hospital door and saying, okay, got to suck it up and go in. They were finding ways to work through it, and whether it meant rationalizing, fooling themselves. But I think they also all just have an obligation. Rob, Rob and many of his colleagues, when I want to, hark back, just almost 2 decades ago when September 11 happened, and, when those buildings went down, Rob and his colleagues headed towards the fire. That's what their job is. So, they're emergency room doctors, and there's a reason for that. And I think most of them have whatever it is in their DNA that firefighters have, that soldiers might have, that all kinds of people who choose those kinds of professions have, that makes them run towards the problem and not away from it.
Rock stars.
That's built into them.
They're like fighter pilots, in the jets, which are a different type. My brother was career Air Force, a different type of animal altogether.
Thank God for them too.
Yeah, but the thing was that one of the fears they had, and one of the fears Rob had, was the responsibility towards his family and the outside community that because they didn't know really about COVID at the time, that they might infect other people. Mm-hmm. And how he has to cope with that, and the other physicians have to cope with it too. One person that Rob believes is one of his colleagues, who I can't remember. She's going to train to be a nurse, but she was so upbeat and positive in his mind. But then he talks to her, and she's really not that way. She has to. She is afraid too. But
and they all worried. I mean, knowing Rob's family as I do, and I've known them all my life, and we're all there, since they've been a family. I can say for sure that there is no chance in hell that Rob's wife and kids would have allowed him not to go into work for fear of them. They're cut from the same cloth. But the fear for one's own family is not unjustified. I mean, as you know from the book, one of Rob's colleagues had a parent die of COVID, and another one nearly died.
Right.
So these things are very real, and the guilt that some of these medical professionals carry, having seen their loved ones infected, and that's not to say that they infected their loved ones. I mean, Deb, for example, never tested positive for COVID. We don't necessarily know how her father and mother got sick. But I don't think, again, like these are the families of people who choose these professions, and I don't think any of them would say, stay home. They're just not built that way.
Yeah, that's the thing. Their training and the dedication, the people like John Gallagher and Deb White, who just throw themselves in there. They're dedicated to the community. And I just have to emphasize about community, because a lot of times when you go to a hospital, you feel, a patient has fear too. And, but they just it's something like Rob thinks about retiring at one point, but it's not something you can do when you're in a metaphor in a battle.
Obviously, like Rob's a hero, but so are the family members because
The family. It's
they're
sad.
taking it on the chin as well.
Tell us about what you have to deal with the family members. That was a very moving part of the book because, we've all heard about it. That people, you bring a parent in,
Oh yeah,
and you might never see them again.
like not getting to hug them and all that.
And then you never see them, and then you can't have
No
a funeral
funeral,
or
dude. Oh.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I want to talk about about a little bit about. I think the answer to that is sort of talking about how the book was formed and when we decided that this was a book. Rob and I didn't really set out in our conversations about COVID to write a book. I called him early on because he's my cousin and I was worried about him. And as we talked, and it was obvious that the talks were somewhat cathartic. I started taking notes, and the sort of journalist notes for news sort of kicked in, and we how do I say we started to think a lot about how how to make this book work, and we didn't want it to be a medical procedural book.
Right.
We didn't want it to be like an episode of ER where it's all about what doctors do. And we didn't quite really know then what it should be about until it clicked on us that this is a book about not just about grief, but about mourning and the absence of mourning. In other words, all these people who lost loved ones and who couldn't properly mourn. Because mourning is a ritual that humanity, it's what separates us from the animals in some sense. I mean, animals mourn too. Of course,
Right, 10,000 years old mourning.
Yeah, but this is what was lost, really, in COVID. Not just the lives, but the ability to remember and to celebrate and to honor and memorialize. And we saw it over and over again how difficult that was. And that's what the book really hinged on, I think, was how well we could capture that and explain it. And make it not about necessarily about proning. I mean, all that stuff about proning and history of emergency medicine. And, I mean, that's important and belongs in the book and carries the book forward in a chronological sense, which is what that's the narrative framework. But the book is really about, it asks a question and hopefully answers it, which is, what do you do when you can't say goodbye to the person you love the most? How does that change the experience of death and the experience of survival? That's what the book is about, and that's what we hoped to capture in the book.
I bet there's a lot of people feeling slated, huh?
Feeling what?
Like slighted, like they didn't get their fair share, like when...
Oh, they couldn't see? Some of the people...
it can be residual, like this must still go on in their mind, like I haven't got...
one of the scenario, I don't know what you call it, book scenes in the book, it's almost like watching a movie, is that some of the people handling the bodies, because first they just put them in a normal body bag, but then they had to use a heavy-duty orange bag, and the people weren't able to go in and see their loved ones die or anything. Some of the people handling the bodies would give them a last look.
This book was very in your face. It's very WTF. Very at all times. Like wow, very descriptive, man. Like you really set the table on that. And sometimes it's hard to hear too, but that it invokes emotion though.
That it does.
It was very intense. I mean, it was a very intense process, unlike anything I've ever really experienced as a journalist. I give credit to Rob for his honesty, and also, it's really a testament to how respected and loved he is by his colleagues.
Yeah. That
they were willing to tell their stories to us, and gave us permission to really tell these very intimate stories. In fact, I want to say that there were some folks in the legal department at the hospital who just couldn't believe that these stories were freely given. And we had to convince them that they were, because and it's because of who Rob is, not just that he's been there 25 years, but because I think he's a trusted and trustworthy character. And we were very, very aware of how much trust was given to us in being allowed to tell these stories. And we have to be really, really, really careful and understand how delicate, these jewels that we were given were, and we didn't want to mess it up. We were aware of how easy it would be to mess it up, make it sensational, make it all about
Right.
blood and guts.
Well, that's the good stuff, the inside scoop.
We had to resist it. At every there was a lot of pressure to do that. That's a typical way.
Yeah.
We had to resist that at every step.
I'm glad you didn't. There's no fat in this book at all. In fact, I'd use it in a creative writing course to show how to write a book like this. We got about 4 more minutes. I just want to say what struck me is, and you've been talking about it, is somebody that had to make a decision to pull the plug on a parent, which is, but I don't even want to talk about it. And you talk about it in the book, is the quality of empathy. John Gallagher taught Rob that, or told Rob, or just in a conversation, you get it from your parents or you don't. And Rob did get it from his parents, from his mother, did he not?
Yeah, and then that's a very key moment in Rob's life. In his first year of medical school, his mother, Barbara, is killed in a car wreck, killed by a drunk driver. That was a galvanizing moment. It didn't make Rob want to be a doctor, but it did send him towards emergency medicine, and it was such a huge loss for him. But I remember his mom. I remember her kindness, and I think that for his entire adult life since then, Rob has been driven by this idea that he needs to honor who his mother was and make her proud, and I believe he has.
Right, for her to die, she was still on the gurney, but let's not get into the details. And I'm glad you didn't really go into a lot of details because it just reads with a certain purity. One of the last things I want to say is that one of the sentiments, I can't remember who it was. I don't have the note. Grief is indivisible. If you could share the feeling, it won't reduce how you feel. That is so true. I think of a John Lennon song where he says, nobody can feel your own pain, which is true.
Yeah.
In this book about empathy and the empathy and community that get them through, the grief and the
Yeah. That's a brilliant thing. I mean, that comes from Rob's dad, Leon.
Right. Yeah.
Duke. And, Leon is a working class guy. A Holocaust escapee. Grew up. Came here not speaking a word of English. Was a school guidance counselor all his life. And for him to come up with that and to explain what it means, and it's so true and it means so much. And I never heard him say that until we started working on the book, and it just is really something that's so true.
Yeah, it is amazing, and I'm going to let you go now because I know you're going to be very busy, and I think you're going to be busy in the future. But I'd like to get you back. There's so much to talk about. But great, it's a great book, Dan, and I hope all the success in the world for it. Okay.
Oh, I've loved this conversation and happy to do it again, and thank you both.
Okay, thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Yep.